Thank you everyone for joining our massive open online course with Amnesty International. I'd like to start this session off with a story to think about really what brings us here today. Imagine that it's March 15th, 2015. Imagine that you and your friends are organizing a peaceful press conference with the goal to create positive social change for your country. As you're discussing the hope you have for methods of peaceful political engagement, hundreds of security guards storm the room. You're among 30 people arrested by the Congolese security officials that day. This is the story of Yves Makwambala and Fred Bauma, who remain in detention at Makala prison in Kinshasa to this day. The two are facing charges of treason, attempted coup, and attempt to take the life of head of a state. We are obviously concerned with attacks on the rights of freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. But unfortunately, this is a reality for hundreds of people every single year. And this is a scenario that we're hoping to end, which is why I'd like to thank you again for joining us in taking action, both by being on this call, but also in the future as we discuss ways to take action at the end of this call. My name is Rana Abdelhamid, and I'm excited and honored to be a facilitator for this massive open online course for Amnesty International. I'm a volunteer with Amnesty International USA and have been involved with Amnesty USA for the past 8 years on various campaigns related to women's rights, torture, and particularly the Arab Spring. I was also the youth delegate for Amnesty International's 2015 International Council meeting. And of course, I'm honored to have with me here today Netsanet, an Ethiopian national. He's the African Director for Research and Advocacy at Amnesty International. And prior to his role, Netsanet was Director of the Policy and Research at Civicus World Alliance for Citizens Participation in Johannesburg, South Africa. He has more than 10 years of experience in promoting and defending human rights at the national, regional, and global levels, and is a trained human rights lawyer. Netsanet spent over 2 years in prison in Ethiopia as a prisoner of conscience for his role in leading human rights activism in the country. So he'll have a lot to say today and will be able to share with us his story, which is extremely inspiring, and I'm really honored to be with him today. Just so everyone knows, this session is going to be around 60 minutes long, and the learning outcomes are that all participants after this session should be able to explain what human rights research and advocacy work look like in practice. They should be better able to understand how a human rights organization selects cases and works with individuals at risk. And then you'll also have the opportunity to learn about ways in which you could directly take action on the case for Fred and Yves in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, particularly looking at the Right for Rights campaign that is hosted by Amnesty International in December. I'd like to now pass over the session to Netsanet, who will speak about his own personal story. And then after that, we'll have the opportunity to talk again about the Rights for Rights campaign and then address some questions that have been sent in by participants of this course. Thank you all so much. Netsanet.
Thank you very much, Rana, for that warm introductions. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's quite exciting to see so many of you taking up interest in the work we do, joining us in this conversation on one of the most important and basic rights of humanity, which is the right to freedom of expression. It's for people like me who spend our daily lives monitoring, campaigning for the rights of individuals like Yves and Fred who remain behind jails. It's quite empowering, reassuring to see that there are so many of you who are interested about the issues that we're dealing with and joining us in those campaigns. As Rana outlined, my objective in this session really is to give you a little bit of insight into how we operate as Amnesty in Africa, and to tell you what our challenges are and how we're going about in campaigning for this right. And also, hopefully, I'll respond to many of the questions which I've seen being posted online. As Rana outlined, let me start with a personal story, and I hope that will give you a little bit of taste into what you stand to achieve, what you stand to result by campaigning. I'm a lawyer by training, as Rana mentioned. I'm Ethiopian. My name, ironically, is literally translated into as freedom. Netsanet means freedom in Amharic. I started my activism back home since I was a graduate student at the Desva University as a lawyer. And a group of us, we felt that the country needs a vibrant civil society, morely focusing on strategic litigations on human rights issues and etc. We felt that the democratic process in the country can be better strengthened by ensuring that citizens actively engage through democratic process by way of election monitoring, observation, voter education, and etc. So we set up a small human rights institution. We used to call it Organization for Social Justice in Ethiopia. And back in 2005, for some of you who have interest in Ethiopian history and may have been following up the political developments then, Ethiopia was passing through one of the most controversial electoral processes at the time. It was a time when there was a relative opening for opposition movements to freely campaign and engage in the process. So we felt that as a civil society, we should be mobilizing citizens to monitor the conduct of the elections and ensure that the elections will become free, fair, and transparent. So we mounted this exercise where we mobilized over 3,000 volunteers like Rana, who would be going from polling stations to polling stations and trying to ensure that the election remains free, fair, and transparent. Little did we know that this will result in what was my fate soon afterwards. The election went wrong. There was massive rigging. People went out in the streets. There was huge protests. Close to 200 people were shot in the streets as a result of those protests. Opposition decided to boycott parliament and the results itself. So one of those typical political crises, as you can imagine. So myself and a group of us in civil society, who've been engaged in this process. We've been calling for a peaceful resolution of the electoral disputes. We've been litigating and restrictions that we were seeing at the time on the right to observe the elections. And we also said what needs to be said. In areas where we have observed election irregularities, we documented and published a report outlining where we see are the irregularities. So by November 2005, the government decided to crack down on everyone, on any dissent. So myself, I ended up in jail in November 2005, along with fellow civil society activists, journalists, political party leaders, and etc. My story is very much similar to Fred and Yves. We were detained incommunicado for a few weeks. We didn't see our families, lawyers. It took a while before the charges were confirmed on us, months actually. We were detained from in a high security detention facility, finally transferred to the Federal Detention Center. And then the charges came in, literally similar to what Fred and Yves are seeing now. Treason, attempt to overthrow the government, incitement, genocide, you name it, treason, and etc. And some of it actually carries similarly like Fred and Yves' death penalty. So we were facing a possible death penalty as well. So the trial dragged on for 2 years and 2 months. Prison life is tough, guys. It's tough for us, but most importantly, it's very tough for family and friends and those who love you. And the most difficult part about prison life is feeling that you are forgotten, that there is no one out there who will stand for you and speak on your behalf, your violations. For us, once we ended up in jail, we wanted to put the state on trial as opposed to us. That was our target. We were confident that there was absolutely no case for us to respond to, and we were prepared to dismiss and destroy the case's allegation, the state's allegation against us. And we did that. We fought through the court throughout 2 years and 2 months of prolonged, protracted trial process. What kept me going and my fellow civil society activists throughout that process is a campaign we received from many, many activists like yourself. Amnesty International and many, many other organizations were behind our campaign. Our cases were never forgotten. We get to hear what people were doing through our families, through our lawyers, through our small radio in prison, and etc. That gave us a lot of energy. And ultimately, we're out after 2 years and a half in jail. All our rights denied, families passing through all that ordeal. And it made us strong. We're here, we're out, and we're doing exactly what we feel needs to be done. Standing in solidarity with colleagues, comrades like Yves and Fred, ensuring that what happened to us will not continue to happen to others. This is my story. I hope it answers some of the questions, doubt that you have, particularly some of the doubts that I've heard from some of you. Do we really have an impact? Will our letter writing will actually yield results? My answer is simple. I'm a living example of how your actions can actually make an impact. So moving away from the personal story, a little bit onto how I spend my days these days. As Rana explained, I'm the Africa Director for Amnesty International. I'm in charge of research and advocacy for the region. So my work involves working with our team of researchers and campaigners across Africa, documenting such violations, including violations on the right to freedom of expression, attacks against human rights defenders, violations in the context of conflicts, and etc., and making sure that sufficient pressure is built on governments, intergovernmental organizations, and etc., to ensure that rights are respected, rights are not violated, and etc. In Africa, we have 3 regional offices now. I'm based in Johannesburg, South Africa, with the Southern Africa Regional Office. But in addition to this one, we have an Eastern Horn and Great Lakes Regional Office in Nairobi, where we have a group of researchers and campaigners who are also leading our work in that region. The third one is in Dakar, which is our West and Central Africa Regional Office as well, which once again has a dedicated team of researchers, campaigners who continue to work on this on a daily basis. In Nigeria, we have also a national office that also have researchers, campaigners who work with this. On top of that, we have over 13 sections in Africa, most of them in West Africa, but also here in Southern Africa and in Eastern Africa, which are local, national presences of Amnesty International, where much of our members, activists, and supporters like yourself come from. So the way we go on about our work is complex, but the story is simple. We have dedicated researchers whose daily responsibility is to closely monitor political and human rights developments in many countries across Africa. We rely on evidences that we secure from partners, individuals on the ground, whom we have long-established relationship with them. We monitor media, we monitor reports, and etc. And we go on research field missions to those countries to testify, to capture testimonies, gather evidences, and build coalitions, and etc. So our information source is wide-ranging. And then, of course, we had to make hard choices. Resources are limited, as you can imagine, so we could not obviously be responding to each and every violation we're seeing. So we had to strategically think, where is it that we can make the biggest impact? Which emblematic cases can we actually take forward and build a campaign and momentum around it to effect change? That's how we came about in choosing the cases like Fred and Yves. We believe that the violations which this activist is emblematic of how the government in DRC is systematically repressing, restricting any form of expression, dissent in the country, especially in lead up to the elections, which is coming next year. For some of you, as you may know, the DRC is going through election next year. The current incumbent president, Kabila, has expressed interest that he may be running for another third term, and we're already seeing signs of restrictions all across civil society, political opponents, and etc., who are actually saying, no, you are not constitutionally mandated to run for a third term. This is wrong. So we just recently published a report on this, if you're interested, for you to understand the broader context which informs how Fred and Yves currently face these trials. Our staff, as I've said, what makes Amnesty different from many other human rights organizations is our movement character. We are an organization that solely depend on the support, resource, voice, and action that our members take. That is our strength. That's the core of our strengths. Over 7 million people, individuals like yourself, who join us as members, as supporters, as volunteers, who would be our champions, who would be our voices out there. So our legitimacy is drawn from that reality. We don't accept resource from government because we want to maintain our independence and impartiality. And we rely on actions in the form of letter writing, petitions, demonstrations, and etc. to influence governments and their behavior in this regard. And ultimately to secure the release of individuals like Fred and Yves, who are solely detained for the opinions and ideas expressed freely. This is what we believe, and part of my role involves engaging with senior high-level government officials in countries where I visit, but also the regional institutions. In Africa, as you may know, we have the African Union, which is a political organ with 54 member states that has various organs and institutions, including a so-called independent human rights institution, which is African Commission on Human and People's Rights. So my team and myself, we regularly engage with officials. We do attend the sessions and summits of the African Union and the Africa session to bring in cases, systematic violations to the attention of these authorities, and most importantly, push for change and effective action on these bodies. We just came out from the 58th session of the African Commission, where we've been profiling and pleading for the Commission to take urgent appeals and measures in respect of activists in Angola, Swaziland, DRC, and etc. Apart from that, we also take some concrete actions by way of litigation, for instance. We try and pick emblematic cases like this where we work in partnership with organizations and take up their cases outside of domestic jurisdictions and try and present their cases for determination in these regional bodies as well. That is broadly what we do. It's a very difficult work. Most cases, it's quite a frustrating endeavor, but at the same time quite rewarding when we see the results, when we see change happening across the region. Maybe let me stop here for now, and maybe let me respond to some of the questions which Rana will bring to my attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Netsanet. That was very much inspiring and also a testament to how important this work is and how important it is that our members and people who are participating in this call are involved with our actions. So one thing I would just like to mention that is an opportunity for participants to engage with is actually the Right for Rights campaign, which is taking place on Human Rights Day on December 10th. However, Amnesty International does have a window where you could get involved with this, which is from December 4th to December 18th. And we've already been able to collect 20,000 pledges for letter writing. And so I'd like to call on all of the participants, if you all can just really pledge to write a letter on behalf of Yves and on behalf of on behalf of our two prisoners of conscience that we just mentioned. Last year, we actually had the opportunity to free Moses Akatugba, who was imprisoned when he was 16 years old. And similar to Netsanet's story, our work was able to his release and provided hope to Moses while he was in jail. So this really does have an impact. So we urge you all to take action, to join us in really advocating on behalf of people who are currently in prison unjustly, simply for expressing a fundamental right. That being said, I'd like to now transition into the questions and give the floor back to Netsanet. So I'll ask some questions that were provided by the participants. The first question that I'd like to ask actually comes from Menka_85, and it's asking if Amnesty International enters into partnerships with other human rights organizations in promoting and defending human rights. And if this is the case, how effective are these coalitions?
Thank you. Definitely. Amnesty International often collaborates and works in partnership with local human rights movements, organizations, and activists. In fact, that's one of the core principles of our work. We believe that our expertise will yield results only and only if we work in partnership with coalitions, activists, and organizations globally. To give you specific tests nationally, for instance, in the way we carry out our researches, we try and assess the situation from the very beginning in collaboration with partners, organizations on the ground. We rely on information we receive from them to verify, to mobilize people around it as well. We have a lot of campaigns where we run in partnership with a lot of organizations in Africa. Coalition building results in every sense as well. Working in partnership is not easy, but we operate on principles and well-established practices to date that enabled us to ensure that we build trust, confidence with people that we work with. We have, obviously, when working in partnership also brings in differences in opinion and positions. That's one area where as Amnesty International, we always try and explain from the very beginning what are the policy and institutional red lines where we may have difficulties in openly joining some campaigns. Since it's beyond the scope of this course, I won't go into the details, but just as an example, there are cases where, while we campaign in partnership with a lot of organizations on questions relating to, for instance, on call for use of force, or on questions relating to certain policies around sexual and reproductive rights, we have a different and progressive policies. On the one hand, we have quite a principled positions around them. So we try and explain as a movement, while we respect views around that, we are unfortunately unable to join you on this. But just to summarize, Rana, as you said it, we work with thousands and thousands of NGOs, activist organizations across Africa and globally throughout our campaigns, research and advocacy work.
Thank you, Netsanet. That was super insightful. Going off of that, I think oftentimes there also might be a challenge in working with organizations in terms of just the danger that comes with that. So Lizzie H asks if there is a danger in public campaigning for individuals such as Fred and Yves, and does this make life in prison more dangerous for them, or is it better to actually have more quiet diplomacy that's behind the scenes where you're not maybe more engaged with the public sphere as loudly as Amnesty International does sometimes?
Yeah. Thank you. Admittedly, there is always some level of danger in any form of public campaign, particularly on behalf of individuals and prisoners of conscience who are facing trials, who are in jail. They may be attacked while they're in jail. The outcome of the trial may actually be quite negative on them, etc. So that's the essence of a backlash of a state against a public campaign outrage around that. But in many cases, in our experience, publicity and such spotlight on cases and plight of activists like this actually provide a certain degree of protection to those activists themselves, and also for the state to be under pressure to ensure that some of the minimum safeguards for fair trial are observed, and etc. So there is that element to it as well. The most importantly, we operate as Amnesty International on a principle of do no harm, and this means at least two things. The first thing is, for each and every piece of campaigning that we do, we initially examine what are the risks involved in a form of public campaigning around this. So we carry out a thorough risk assessment, identify where are the risks and what are the mitigating strategies around it. And it's after we've done such a comprehensive assessment that we roll out a campaign of this nature, which involves public action and voice and noise. And secondly, and this is throughout our research and campaigning activity, we ensure that we've received informed consent from people for whom we're campaigning for. And so we talk to their families, lawyers, and make sure that individuals for whom we're publicly campaigning for fully understand the risks involved in any public campaigning and the result of amnesties being involved in it. It's only after we've secured that informed consent that we engage in this form of public campaigning. And throughout, we try and balance what strategy works best, quiet diplomacy, public campaigning, and etc. And in each and every case, we have multi-pronged approach. We mix up the quiet ones and the public advocacy. We try and use our good offices, interlocutors, and etc. to effect change.
Thank you. And also, to come back to your point and your information about the work that you do specifically with various African countries, Vivian Watson-Toft has asked, from the perspective of Amnesty International, has the cause of human rights and freedom of expression gained ground in any African countries in recent years?
That's a difficult question. You know, cases like DRC from Angola, Algeria, Ethiopia, Eritrea, now most recently Burundi, all of these paint a gloomy picture. There's no denying that as a region, we're increasingly facing restrictions on the right to freedom of expression, assembly, and association. Dissent is criminalized all across, and increasingly criminalized all across. Some governments have seen the impact of popular movements, such as in North Africa, that has the potential of changing despotic authoritarian regimes, and so they've stepped up their repressions around that. We see restrictive NGO laws coming in, we see restrictive freedom of expression laws coming in, and etc. So there is that, unfortunately, sad reality about Africa all across. But at the same time, there are tremendous progress in Africa, and not everything is doom and gloom. If we look at Africa where it was just 20, 25 years ago, and now where we are, there's undeniable tremendous progress, both in terms of the legislative and normative framework to exercise one freedom of expression. Most countries' laws do enable activists, journalists to freely express their views, political parties and opponents. Radio stations, community radios, journalists, newspapers do freely operate in a lot of countries. Most recently, in a lot of countries, very progressive freedom of access to information laws have also been adopted, where citizens can actually get information needed for them to publicly and meaningfully engage with the governments as well. And we can cite many examples around that as well. The jurisprudence on the right to freedom of expression has also progressed in Africa, and largely to enormous contribution by the African Commission, domestic judicial processes, and etc. And so we are definitely and unquestionably more freer than we were 2 or 3 decades ago. But at the same time, there is undeniable trend of backlash, of regression in a lot of countries where we see there is an increasing attack on freedom of expression and activists as well. So it's a mixed picture, Rana. That's where we are.
Yeah, because sometimes it could get really gloomy, but it's important to remember that there is progress that's taking place. And so I appreciate the fact that you were able to highlight those, because it also just shows that there is hope and we can make an impact on these issues.
Yeah.
The next question is by Banana Green, and it actually is a follow-up to that question, and that is, how can someone who's an activist avoid being jailed? Are there tactics that are used, especially when there is so much corruption within the system? And how do these activists find hope and continue to do the work that they're doing?
That's a delicate question, Rana, and it's it's context specific. Obviously, I mean, it's very difficult to generalize. How is it one can safely and securely remain as an activist in places in Africa?
But there are, fundamental principles and practices out there. I mean, the first thing is knowing your rights. I think all of us need to understand what is our rights, what are the limits to our rights, and how do we defend them when we're confronted with such repression around it. Unfortunately, human rights education in Africa is a lot to be progressed in that area. Citizens do not actually know their rights and how to claim it. So the chances of being abused and repressed and thrown in jail at times is quite high, simply because you don't know whether you're entitled to do that or not. And secondly, it's also about ensuring that you work in partnership with others. So there's always that degree of protection that one would get by ensuring that they know which organizations to access, they know which networks to work with, and they know how to engage in those processes itself. And thirdly, this is something which Amnesty International does with so many of our partners and activists across Africa and the world, is equipping activists with some of the basic tools they need to protect their privacy, their information, their contacts, and etc. This ranges from digital security in the way they're corresponding their information, actions amongst themselves, common techniques that they need to understand to protect themselves from unwarranted attacks, and etc. The basic safety and security empowerment that needs to happen, which Amnesty International supports all across. And the third, and obviously the most important element, is try and ensure that when you face that kind of attack, when you face that kind of charge, that you remain as engaged, as loyal to the law, to the principles you stand for. In a number of instances, activists who ended up in charges or in courts are faced with an awful dilemma, a dilemma of how to defend oneself and live through it, and challenge the legality versus finding different ways of securing one's release. So there's those fundamental principles which needs to be there. The job is risky, there's no denying. In many countries, not just in Africa, but across the world, activism is risky and rightfully risky, and it inherently, a certain degree of risk comes with that. But that can be overcome when most of us join in that club, most of us join in defense of others, and most of us know our rights and know how to claim it as well.
Thank you for answering that tricky question in such a nuanced way. Super insightful again. So the next question actually looks at being realistic versus being optimistic. And the user who's asked it is Pensa Jonant. And they say that the truth is that signing petitions on behalf of prisoners of conscience worldwide does indeed change lives. However, and I write this with heavy heart, that there are cases in which no amount of campaigning, letter writing, and petitioning will secure the release of prisoners unjustly imprisoned or save them from execution. So when Amnesty International observes that the authorities remain intransient and don't seem to want to budge, what course of action does it then take?
Thank you. Indeed, a realistic dilemma. We as Amnesty International, we believe in sustaining this campaign. There's so many countries in Africa who've not at all progressed in any way, form, or shape in opening up space for dissent, for freedom of expression, and etc. Countries like Eritrea as an example, countries like Angola as an example. These are countries where, despite sustained international pressure, criticism, and etc., those countries remain closed. It remains extremely dangerous to operate in those countries. Prisoners of conscience and activists, journalists remain in jail for years, and despite all our campaigning, little change has come in those countries. But we believe sustaining one's campaign, sustaining one's advocacy, sustaining one's struggle on these issues will yield results. Who would have imagined that South Africa would have overcome apartheid? Who would have imagined that we will be living in such a free society world here today in South Africa? Who would have imagined many of the dictators across Africa will be gone? Who would have imagined that such a tremendous and swift change would have come in Burkina Faso most recently? These are the changes that happened because people sustained those actions around that. So if one thing which we're best known for as Amnesty is we don't let go. These are the countries where we clearly know change is not going to come soon. Change will take a long time, and so but we sustain our analysis, our exposure, and our campaigning in those countries until the day we see a change there. And then we explore various other avenues that will increase the pressure on those governments to change it. We go outside and litigate. We go outside and build support and momentum around it through the diaspora community. We try in institutions. We force governments to consider the relationships. We push for targeted sanctions where we think it's relevant, and etc. That's the way the geopolitics works. Pressure comes in different ways, and we try and sustain that as much as possible. So that's unfortunately reality, but that is the only way to bring about change and not lose hope.
Mm-hmm. Thank you again. And to follow up on that, obviously there are a lot of different cases that Amnesty International must come across. So Pence Sejena also asks how Amnesty International keeps track of all of these cases and how it selects the cases that they choose to focus on, and ensure that not anyone is forgotten throughout this process.
Yeah. Well, as I've said at the beginning, our resources are not infinite. So at the end of the day, we have to make hard choices on what cases, what issues to campaign for. What we need to ensure is that we have a sustained monitoring mechanism, and we do. And most of the countries in Africa, we have dedicated experts whose daily function is to monitor political, human rights, socioeconomic developments in those countries. And through that process, we'll get to understand patterns and trends where we believe will be impacting on freedom of expression, for instance, or development that may result in conflicts, and etc. So we keep track of patterns and developments. And through that research, and our research is an extended process itself, we also get to understand which cases will be emblematic enough to bring a much bigger impact and change in those countries, so that we focus on them but ensure that a much bigger impact comes as a result. So that the way we choose about cases essentially is informed by the strategic choices. If only we had the capacity, we could have raised each and every case, but we don't. Mm-hmm. You won't have the time to sign letter to each and every one we tell you to sign as well. So we have, unfortunately, we have to make these choices. And a change on one case can actually bring about a more structural shift in a country. That's what we aim for in general. And we don't forget. We systematically document violations. We systematically document victims, and we publish it in different ways. In those cases which we are unable or won't have the capacity to mobilize such a global campaign, we try and make sure that those cases are captured in our annual reports, in our seminar reports, in our thematic reports, as much as possible. And we do bring those issues to the attention of authorities in many ways, in our conversations in regional institutions, in our meetings with governments, and etc. But it's about choices. It's about ensuring that we make a strategic impact and change in a country by using emblematic cases of this nature.
That you actually make a segue that's great for the next question. Raquel Valentin asks about the African human rights system and how you just describe its current state, whether it's effective, and then also just talk a little bit about the African Union and what role it plays in promoting and protecting human rights in the region.
Good. So the African Union, which is, and primarily its human rights institutions, like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which headquartered in Gambia, Banjul, the African Court itself, the African Court on Human and People's Rights, which is based in Arusha in Tanzania, and also we have a Committee on the Rights of the Child, which is also another human rights body of the region. So these institutions, together with the political organ of the African Union, they do play a relevant role in promoting various rights, including freedom of expression across Africa. The oldest of these institutions is the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and from where it started and where it is now, we believe that it has slowly but steadily ensured that many governments in Africa are accountable to those rights enshrined under the African Charter, under the International Convention on Human, Civil and Political Rights, and etc. The Commission has developed a considerable jurisprudence, a body of jurisprudence in a lot of cases, including on freedom of expression, association, and assembly. Through individual communications, decisions made on individual communications relating to violations in this regard, through adopting model laws, guidelines, general comments, and etc. Now, Africa has a much bigger body of jurisprudence on how these rights should be protected across Africa. Despite its successes, I mean, there is no denying that the performance of the African human rights systems, by and large, is below satisfactory. There's no question there. The institutions are not well funded and extremely under-resourced. That's one of the challenges. States generally do not comply with decisions and orders and resolutions passed by the human rights body. So compliance is one of the significant challenges we face today. And thirdly, the AU political organs, which are really mandated and sanctioned to ensure that there is compliance with human rights decisions, that they take effective measures for compliance on human rights issues, are not really delivering what they're supposed to deliver. And at times, we've witnessed how the AU political organs also interfere with the independent and impartial human rights determination by these bodies as well. So it's a very slow progress in that regard. So for instance, if we look at whether case Fred and Yves, whether they are entitled, for instance, to bring to their cases directly before the African Court on Human and People's Rights, and to seek a determination on the violation of their rights, they are unable to do it today for a number of reasons. One, the Democratic Republic of Congo is yet to ratify the protocol that established the African Court itself. And this is one of the challenges we have across Africa. Many countries are yet to ratify, adopt, and domesticate some of the regional human rights instruments that are currently in place. And even if they were, even if DRC were to ratify this protocol, it still needs to make a declaration as per the protocol establishing the court, a specific declaration that allows individuals like Fred and NGOs on behalf of individuals like Fred and Yves to file complaints and communications before the court. And DRC has not done it yet, obviously. So as a result of such limitations, directly by the fact that member states are yet to ratify the necessary instruments, citizens are denied access to some of the human rights mechanisms in Africa as well. So this is how I assess it. Definitely the continent and the regional human rights institutions have achieved tremendous success in building a large body of jurisprudence, in holding so many governments accountable for their human rights violations. but still the progress is far from satisfactory. A lot more needs to be done to ensure that states comply with decisions, ratify relevant instruments, and that the political organ of the African Union actually delivers on what is expected to deliver by pushing for compliance and by making decisions that will enable protection of human rights.
Thank you. And also going off of that, it might be interesting if you could talk a little bit to the question that was asked by Dharma Deva, which basically asked, what effect or influence can China have in African countries in relation to human rights policies, violations, practices, given the investment that China makes in African countries? And then if you could also talk about the influence that the U.S. can have, particularly if you have these regional institutions that maybe are not having as extreme or as large of an impact as they could be having. So how do you shift that and make that international push?
Coincidentally, South Africa is hosting the China-Africa Summit here in Johannesburg. The Chinese president is here in South Africa. China has pledged over $60 billion, as you may have heard, to support by way of concessional loans, non-concessional loans to African governments and to the institutions around that. So there's no denying that China's trading portfolio in Africa is growing and substantially growing. It's one of the biggest trading partners of Africa. It's one of the countries that's bringing huge amount of resource, business, and foreign direct investment into the continent. But its track record and its impact in improving the human rights record of many African countries is actually minimum. There's very little effect that we see of China's progressive support to human rights respect in the continent. In fact, many studies suggest that there's many more human rights violations that are coming in the way Chinese businesses conduct themselves in those countries, in the way they treat their labor force, in the way they secure those tenders, and etc. So China's success in improving human rights record in Africa is invisible and at times even counterproductive. But I wouldn't over-glorify or over-criticize China as being the main culprit behind human rights regression in Africa. Far from that. And the responsibility mainly lies with governments. It is governments who are shielding themselves from international criticism that are resulting in it. The US and many other governments, the global north, west, and also in Africa, they have played a key role, a significant role in the promotion of protection of human rights in the continent. And the US specifically sometimes has raised the stakes for rights violating countries by way of targeted sanctions, as we've seen it most recently, for instance, on Burundi, where the US government has issued targeted sanctions on individuals suspected of fueling violence in Burundi, for instance. And similarly in South Sudan, where the US has consistently raised the stakes for those suspected of violating human rights in every sense. So there's a number of ways the US and many other Western governments have played a role in that. But at the same time, and it should be very, very clear to all of us, that the US has turned a blind eye and at times has been complicit in some of the serious human rights violations we're seeing in Africa, especially in the context of the war on terrorism in Africa. In many countries where we're seeing those measures taken in the name of counterterrorism, laws adopted in the name of fighting terrorism, have resulted in attack against freedom of expression, has resulted in journalists, activists going behind jail, charged with treason, charged with terrorism, and etc. And the US has chosen and deliberately chosen to remain silent on those. We've seen in a number of African countries where resources, financial contributions that are coming from the US are directly financing, supporting police units, military units that are responsible for serious human rights violations documented. And we've documented this all across Africa in many ways. So in that sense, there is a lot to be said, there's a lot to be criticized about how the US conducts its business in Africa and how it actually contributes and at times turns a blind eye to serious violations of human rights. So that's a mixed picture.
Yeah, and it's a very complicated one at that, given the huge amounts of investment, but lack of promotion of human rights, unfortunately. And actually, going off of that, our last question is by Kofi73, and he asks about he asks about how AI or Amnesty International can do something about the fact that a lot of African countries benefit from Western countries' support because of strategic national interests and geopolitical interests, as you mentioned, but that necessarily does not translate into human rights progress or human rights outcomes, as you stated. So what can AI do?
Well, mainly this is already happening. I mean, Amnesty International usually and consistently calls upon donor countries and institutions to ensure that the recipient of their financial and other support and aid do respect fundamental human rights. We try and press up on them to ensure that they do not harm through this kind of cooperations they engage with some of the countries in Africa. What Amnesty International, out of principle, does not support is the use of aid and funding or the targeted sanctioning of aid and cooperation as a way of leveraging pressure on countries. We believe that's counterproductive. We can, that resource that comes for aid to support many African countries to save people who are in dire need of food aid, medical health, and etc. Would only result in massive scale human rights violations if states are holding aid as a leveraging tool to effect rights. That doesn't work. We've seen it in so many African countries across the world where actually such a practice has been counterproductive. We do not support that at all. But at the same time, donors and governments have a responsibility to ensure that in their bilateral and multilateral relationship with African countries, that they need to ensure that there is a clear, transparent, principled positioning on how African governments should be respecting fundamental human rights as they do that. We press upon them that they should be consistent in the way they're engaging at the Human Rights Council or bilaterally when they engage with the governments and etc. Our reports invariably and consistently contain recommendations to these countries on how they should be conducting their relationship with them. And not just those countries, but in institutions like the World Banks and others as well. And we do have dedicated meetings with them through our offices and movements across the world with headquarters and institutions to ensure that. So that's how we engage with them. So in many ways, it's already happening, and in some respects, yielding results. But at the same time, we believe that the relationship should be based on principles and values and the international human rights law. It doesn't mean that we will not be supporting targeted sanctions. I mean, in cases, for instance, like Burundi and South Sudan and etc., Amnesty International has actually openly called for targeted sanctions on individuals who are reasonably suspected of committing violations. This includes travel ban restrictions, asset freezes, and etc. We don't shy away from pushing for that when we believe it's needed, but we do not believe holding aid as a blackmail, as a leverage for effecting change will work.
Great, thank you so much. And if you have some closing remarks, because our time is about up, do you have anything else to share you'd like to say?
Few words. I mean, as I've said in the beginning, the degree to which we're successful here in Africa relies on how Amnesty progresses in building its legitimacy and strength as a movement. We're only as strong as who we have behind us. It's only when we show that there are millions and billions of people behind us who stood up for Yves and Fred, who would stand up and say, when these violations happen, it's wrong. People will go out in the street, who will make noise, who will scream, who will organize and demand action. It's only when that happens that we're successful. So as you finish your course, I'm appealing you to reflect on how you'd continue to engage with us. Immediately and most importantly, we're asking you to join us in the letter writing campaign. We need your voice. We need your letters. That will ensure Fred and Yves feel that they're not alone, that there are millions and millions out there behind them. But most importantly, you need to join us for the long haul. You joining us as members, you joining us as supporters, you petitioning our request will give us the strength and impact that we can achieve. We can get many, many people out of jail. We can change reality. And as I've said at the beginning, I'm a living testament of that.
Thank you so much, Netsanet, and thank you all for joining us today. And we really do urge you to take action and join us on Right for Rights and join thousands of other Amnesty International members across the world in really standing up against injustice and standing for freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Thank you all again.